stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, strive for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Welcome to the Money Powered Land Solidarity Podcast. We're here today with Dr. Brittany Lewis. I'm very thankful to have you here. Can you start just with an introduction? Introduce yourself to our listeners. Who are you and what is your work?
As Jake introduced, I'm Dr. Brittany Lewis. I am a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. I'm also the founder of a research consulting firm called Research in Action. So at CURA, I'm in charge of defining all our large-scale research projects and the agenda that they will take. The first couple of years that I got here, we completed a 2-year study on gentrification. We just finished a study on evictions. I also bring a very specific, innovative action research model, which presumes, multiple things, that the research product itself should aim to build community power, that the outcomes of the research should focus on addressing systemic inequities, and that the policy solutions that we stand on and recommend have to come from a community-centered place.
That's awesome. Can you talk a little bit about that research on gentrification and evictions that you've been doing recently? And for folks who might be unfamiliar with Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, could you describe the situation here in terms of housing, the housing market, people's experience of housing, especially as it concerns working class people and Black and brown people?
Okay. So with the gentrification project, I'll say we never take on a project unless we have strong community-based partnership with local advocates and nonprofits, and they have expressed a deep interest in the need of the project and its impact on the people they serve. So gentrification came out of a connection with the Equity in Place table, which is a group of local nonprofits both in the Twin Cities and St. Paul. In short, they were reporting things that the folks that they serve were sharing with them about housing and their access to housing, particularly low-income folks and Black and brown folks who are getting pushed out of particular parts of the city. These nonprofits were saying they were going to their policymakers, and the policymakers, in short, were saying, prove it. Prove that gentrification is actually even happening. And the reality of it is, policy doesn't move unless research says it needs to. Any policy that has been created has been informed by some researcher, often who doesn't connect with, work with, or move within community, has said, this is what's happening in community. So they reached out to us, and we're like, okay, we're going to partner with you to see what this looks like. The first map that we created we called a Shrinking Cities map. And this map looked at the median rent and the median household cost across the city, across different racial and ethnic groups. And what you saw in the maps from 2000, I think, to 2015 was that the city starts to shrink literally for Black and brown folks with where they could afford to live. That was the beginning of the gentrification project. So we did some initial data work to discern, is there a large-scale project here? And it was clear that there was. So we took on this 2-year pursuit. You can get academics, nonprofit leaders, advocates in a room, and no one's going to agree on a definition of gentrification. That's just not going to work. So what we ended up doing was we took 3 well-respected indexes. These are metrics used to measure neighborhood change, some from the Federal Reserve Bank, some from Lisa Bates in Portland State, other scholars, and we mapped them over the Twin Cities. And we said if 2 or more of those indexes matched, they're experiencing gentrification pressure. And we identified 5 cluster neighborhoods. In North, the Willard Hay and Harrison neighborhoods. South, a cluster of neighborhoods in South, Phillips East, West, Central, Bryant, Powderhorn. In Northeast, it was all of the Arts District plus some of the cursory neighborhoods. In St. Paul, Frogtown, Thomasdale, Hammond, Midway. We narrowed in those areas, and then I did in-depth interviews in all those communities. We looked at 4 constituents: business owners, long-term owners, renters. I think it was short-term owners. Are they right? Business owners, renters, homeowners, short-term. And it was fascinating nonetheless. So the interest was, does resident perception match what data tells us? Something that's super important here at CURA is mixed method research. Numbers can tell you whatever you want it to, like, period. And I think data is often used to skew realities without stories grounded in actual lived materiality and experience. And so we don't believe we're going to take on any project without having both of those to support and engage in a deep discussion. So I did all of those interviews across those cluster neighborhoods, and it was really fascinating. And I think the thing that came out of the report for us that was fascinating is that in any geographic area, the politics of gentrification can happen drastically different, even miles apart. So there's this national discussion about gentrification, these common narrative themes, okay, so it's a coffee shop and it's hipsters on a bike. So we've picked up on these common themes, but it's much deeper than that. And I think when we did the study, it was super interesting to see how the politics of gentrification in Northeast and North were happening. We're just a bridge away. And we really wanted to be really clear with folks about what the economic engines behind the politics of gentrification were in these distinct areas that were literally miles apart. And that was a huge intervention that our report made, not just in the Twin Cities, but national scholarship does not talk about gentrification that way. So that was the gentrification report. And I feel like some of the themes that came out on the North Cluster, for instance, the politics of a historic designation being used as a tool for gentrification, where you have one of the few Black and brown neighborhoods left with historic housing stock in good condition, now going through a process where, if determined to be a historic area, you'd have to be able to afford to maintain the historic architecture, go through certain contractors, and you have folks trying to resist that politic, but only a group of about 10 people were able to make that happen. Mostly privileged white folks who move into the neighborhood to benefit from some of the cheapest housing stock we have left in the city.
And understand how those policy tools work, how a historic designation will be beneficial to their project of creating their little, wow.
100%. That was one of a huge theme that came out in North. Outside of folks saying very blanketly, development in North happens when those with the most power move. So, for instance, you had a lot of really engaged Black and brown folks who said, I've been showing up to community meetings for decades and more asking for the change, but it only comes when white people come. So then people are talking about their relationship to the city and their notions of citizenship a great deal in those interviews. They understood that they moved nothing. And there's a sense of hopelessness attached to that. On the Northeast side, I mean, we were able to say, and we'll all say unapologetically, that this space has gentrified beyond any other place that we're looking at. And the infusion of the arts, the arts designation infused an arts economy that took a place that was once a safe haven for what you call raw artists, moving from downtown district where there's cheap work live space, looking for a place after city regulation in downtown increased. Is no longer an option. And this is both the working class white population. We saw actual movement displacement of working class white folks out of Northeast as a result of gentrification. We have multiple maps to illustrate that is an actual fact in reality. When we did our interviews, I was interviewing a number of white artists in particular who are I'm now moved, my artist studio, I can't afford here anymore. I've been moved out to the further suburban areas. And they talked about what it was like before. And it was super fascinating. So there's a lot happening in Northeast. So what's happening now? Tech industry, digital industry, private firms are buying up space like crazy in Northeast. And they're driving up the leasing costs. So live workspace is impossible unless you have a product that can be mass produced. So digital art is thriving in the Northeast side. And I can keep going on and on.
Honestly, I have to just stop and acknowledge that it's I felt like I was going to cry when you were speaking because I'm from Northeast. And it's not to say, it's not about comparing because there's obviously capitalism, gentrification in the U.S. always comes with racialized violence and Black and brown people suffer the most violence. Also, I grew up around a lot of working class white people who got displaced, and it's a weird experience when it's especially I went to college, I fly coffee and I dress like a hipster. I'm a hipster, you know what I'm saying? But I was over at Anna Lake's at the coffee shop on Central before I came here to kind of touch in. And I'm this used to be Central Foods. This was a hood little grocery store. And now I'm in here and I feel like slapping the shit out of everybody in here. So it's just like something about acknowledging the reality of what's happening is really powerful, you know,
Yeah.
and to acknowledge that it happens differently in different places. Could you talk a little bit about who's winning and who's losing right now? So you kind of touched on that, but if you could respond to that prompt.
So something that's really huge for us in the gentrification report, and I think kind of connects to the evictions report a bit, is we believe development should be beneficial for everyone. So when we are often presenting to council members or other power brokers, we say that there was not one person in the interviews that didn't want to benefit from growth. And we want to support policies that is inclusive of everyone. And the reality of it is Black and brown folks and low-income folks are on the chopping block as the politics of gentrification, which the reality of it is was in the works decades ago. And I don't think most people know, most people don't understand the politics of urban development, because what's happening right now got started in the 70s. Like, in the sense that the way in which urban renewal politics have happened in this country, it was something that was going to happen. The question is, what role does city government and power brokers play to ensure that those can benefit from the growth that was going to happen anyway because of how the politics of investment have happened in urban cities?
So tell me if I'm right. Basically, in the 1970s, people were realizing, okay, we've divested from the city so thoroughly that the property is so cheap that now there's like room to come back and invest and make a profit. Is that what you mean by like the...
So something that I think, for instance, when you think about like Reaganomics, for instance, where we go away from public subsidy down to private investment, you shift a relationship that cities have with private investors. And there was a complete dismantling of public investment through the 70s and the 80s. Now, cities had to redefine those relationships, and an influx of private money also determined a shift in agendas, because now you have to build relationships and make compromises with those folks whose goal is only profit.
Yeah.
And that really shifted a lot of like how we're thinking about investment and disinvestment in spaces. So now what's left? Prime real estate is downtown. Because we divested in the city, right? So the suburbs was the answer. It's no longer the answer. And the best place to benefit profit-wise is the city. Yeah. And because we rely so much on private funding, cities rely so much on private funding. It's almost like a situation has been created where they need each other to sustain itself. And I think the cities have lost its, I would say it's lost its, the city are not holding private investors and developers accountable. I just don't think they are. No. They're just not.
Honestly, one of the most striking things about this last couple of years of being more engaged in like city politics is how much of a kind of a right-wing orthodoxy there is in the way that people think. It's like complete subservience to capital, complete like, real private-public partnership is like the left fringe that people will even consider. And it's just unreal, kind of. Could you talk about, in your work, do you see options for municipal governments? What could city governments do to even the score a bit, to try, if we're going to do positive development for Black people, brown people, working class people, what could it look like? What are some of the policy tools that excite you? Do you see models other places?
So in every setting that I'm in with policymakers, and I'm in quite a bit, they're always throwing a bunch of ideas at the wall, right? They'll have 20 plus ideas at the wall, none of which they can actually implement effectively. So when I'm in these rooms, I say, how about we pick 2 or 3 things you know you can do well? Meaning a policy is just an idea. And once it's passed, a department or a supervisor has to implement it. And most of the time, that department supervisor is never at the table when you're dreaming up all these ideas, right? So you as a policymaker are thinking about the ethics of the people that voted for you, what you want to sell to people that voted for you. And like, I did this thing. But this thing is going to have no teeth unless the people that have been employed to employ it and implement it share that same vision. That's usually never the case. So when I'm in these spaces, I'm always trying to produce tangible options. Some of the things I'm always suggesting in the developer game, we need to have targeted programs for developers of color, period. We need to be unapologetic about this because most of us don't have $500,000 sitting in our bank accounts. Because in order to get a development off the ground, oh man, you have to at least put up about 20% of the capital when you're working with a bank to get a commercial development loan. You also have to have a sizable number of assets to prove that the bank is willing to take that risk on you. Most small developers of color don't have that. Doesn't mean they don't have the skill sets, whether it's Black architects, Black developers, Black construction teams, all that have the skill sets to make those things happen. There aren't resources to help support them. So they often have to be a part of these larger development projects owned by mostly white men. And they get crumbs, as far as I'm concerned, in the larger projects. The city needs to stand tall on supporting programs specific for developers of color. But then they say, well, fair housing laws prevent us from saying that explicitly. But so what implicitly happening is that white developers are getting everything. Mm-hmm. But fair housing laws don't stop us from doing that. So that's like something I'm always pushing. As far as models, something that I'm doing. So in addition to my work as a researcher, I started a development company called Urban Excellence. And I'm deeply invested in North Minneapolis. I'm deeply invested in thinking about innovative ideas in North. So 2 things that we're getting off the ground right now, building accessory dwelling units. So working with Black families and families of color that own and can build something on their own properties and generate wealth that way. We're also looking to develop kind of a mid-range property where cooperative options are available. I think we have to start thinking differently about development. I think we have to give community the power to determine what their living communities look like and feel like. They're not going to be invested unless they have a stake. And in most cooperative frames, there's a financial stake that I think folks should have a part of. I know folks have been proposing tiny homes, and there's been so much resistance. There's issues and there's resistance. The city, for instance, we wanted to do some East Coast style brownstone and garden apartment pieces. But the city, this is not popular here in the Twin Cities. So people at the city are I don't know how that would work. What's the legalese?
Yeah.
It was so if someone actually owns the garden apartment below and someone owns it above, they're so what's the legal boundary? They're struggling, I think, in the city to rethink their development models, to think more innovatively, because they just haven't done it before.
I thought it was interesting reading the Minneapolis 2040 comprehensive plan that's got so much attention on housing policies. And just to a comment on kind of the capitalist orthodoxy is that they specifically mention tiny homes and 3D printer manufactured homes, which is hey, more power to you, whatever. I'm not here to stop innovation, but don't say anything about public housing or social housing or cooperative housing. So it's you could think of some technological quirk to make a physical oddity, but the idea of cooperative economics, socialist economics, or just racially explicit language to deal with the reality of white supremacy is beyond the pale. You can't. It's interesting. Can you talk more about how you made that switch? Not even that switch, but how did you explicitly get involved in economic development, housing development? I'm curious about the motivation from being a scholar and being a researcher and an activist to getting in the game in that way. What was the motivation and what's that been like for you?
I think my motivation, I don't know, it was an interesting eye-opening moment where I had policymakers calling me all the time to advise them on housing policy. And I feel most people don't. You elect people who really don't know how these policies and practices work. That's just they reach out to folks like us, whether it's researchers, folks have developed an expertise in the area to tell them, what should I do? And I found it to be really fascinating as folks kept reaching out to me And I'm trying to both advise them on what is tactical, what is winnable, and what makes the most sense for the communities that we want to serve. And that part of me was just like, why don't I put my money where my mouth is? Because I'm sharing ideas on how I think things should happen. And I'm also seeing the ways they're butchering it in the process. I see the many roadblocks of what it means to even work in government. So I also, I sympathize on some level because I've met some folks that have good intentions, but then they hit so many roadblocks and I think they lose steam.
Yeah.
And then I think innovation kind of dies in some of that process. So when, my partner and I were talking, and we're just like, what's stopping us from using all the expertise that we have and doing it ourselves? Because we're waiting for someone else. And I think that's also a part of the problem. I think we are waiting for someone else to provide the solutions. I think, as a activist, someone who believes in protest and showing up, and there's a time and place for that work, there's also a time and place for us to say, when are we going to stop waiting for someone else to show up on our behalf? And that was really what that was about for me. I'm like, you know what? We can do this ourselves. And I can also use my own social capital to try to push these policies into action. So I'm continually working extremely hard on trying to get these supports up for small developers of color.
Yeah.
It has become like a deep interest of mine, both on the policy end. I'm working with multiple city departments in St. Paul and Minneapolis, plugging council members, helping them think through what it could look like on paper, where the funds could come from. Like, if you're willing, I think it's possible if you're committed to it. And it's a long game. Development is a long game.
Yeah.
Let me just...
That's really profound. It's like really inspiring, honestly. I want to like keep following this thread of just like a holistic approach and holistic work. And like, I knew you before we both kind of got deeper into the weeds on housing, me not as much as you, as like a scholar who was interested in liberation, like the liberation of women, of Black people, of all people. I'm curious how you see the struggle for like just housing and just development fit into like the broader project of liberation. Like, how does the current housing situation kind of reinforce patriarchy and white supremacy? And how does like the work that you're doing, what's the bigger aim? How could it impact more than just where somebody lives? How does that connect to like the rest of our lived experience?
I've always been deeply committed to working with Black and brown communities, Black families, and women in particular. And I always allowed their own lived realities to guide me to where the place that I need to investigate the most. And it was always housing. It was never not housing. And when I think about the Black scholars and intellectuals and even activists that inspire me, they were always talking already about housing. So for instance, on the Evictions project, I went back to look at some Black women writers that I'm deeply inspired by, and thinking about what they were writing about. So Ann Petrie writes this book in response to Native Son in the 1940s, and she's talking about slumlords. And even prior to that, when we're talking about place, the fight connected to segregation or Jim Crow, it's always been connected to property and land. It's always been connected to land and ownership. I think the liberation movement has always been connected to our notion of citizenship that was connected to property. Who owns what? And who owns what often determines your health, access to equitable, school programs and activities. It's always connected to housing in some kind of way. In the Evictions project, where close to 50% of the city's evictions are happening in 2 zip codes, or close to 60% of those women in practice over North Minneapolis are Black women with children. It's not shocking to me at all that what they are dealing with in North is a market that creates slumlords. I also want to be really clear when I do these presentations on evictions. I think there are good landlords, bad landlords, good tenants and bad tenants, but we created a market where landlords can thrive, like point blank, period. And we need to come to terms with that as a country. So why do we need slumlords? Because we do, actually. I think that's actually kind of mess up part of it, because we have used unlawful detainers to lock people out of the traditional market. Well, where are they going to go?
So everybody knows even being a privileged white man, being broke is, like, yeah, if you got a landlord that's really on the ball and comes and fixes stuff, he also gonna be all in your house and gonna have different, not gonna let me rent because my credit's messed up. So yeah, wow, I never heard it phrased that way though, as far as like we need slumlords, like.
Literally, it's like we create a need for slumlords.
Yeah.
I don't believe slumlords should be in business.
Yeah, that's right, I feel you.
But we created the need for them.
Yeah.
And I think we have to acknowledge that. Like, how are we supporting Black and brown folks who are being pushed to a market where they are exploited? And exploited on multiple levels. And I think so for instance, there's a lot of data that we produce that shows that when tenants start asking for repairs, they're getting evicted, right? And that's super common, right? And we can track that. The one area that's not tracked as much, which we track in our report and actually got connected to a lawsuit that's currently in active litigation, is sexual harassment happening in these properties. This is a huge issue that goes unprosecuted much of the time. We create a setting where that's possible. We create a setting where that's possible and typically goes unlitigated. Like, we make that possible. Everything is connected to housing, in my humble opinion.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't see, I think, the liberation of Black and brown people separate from the land. And the land, and whatever structure is on the land that kind of sustains family interaction, space, and building.
Yeah.
Whatever fashion that takes. Unfortunately, we've been locked out of that process, where 20% of homeowners in Minneapolis are Black compared to 75%. And I also want to be clear that I don't think home ownership is for everybody. I think it's just a metric that we use to compare things.
That's a whole other interview.
Right.
Yeah,
like, that's a metric that we use to compare things to make a point.
Yeah.
And I think the point stands still. Like, it proves the impacts of, housing discrimination, redlining, and racial covenants, right? That there is a wealth gap in investing in housing. So that's why it's used. But I don't think that's what we should be pushing for everyone. I don't think that's what everyone wants.
Yeah. I was curious how doing this research on top of living through the gentrification of your hometown, like, you're from the Twin Cities, how has it been on your heart, in your mind, in your body? Like, how has that been for you? How do you manage living through it and also doing the work of doing these interviews, doing the research? Like, I'm curious what your experience has been personally over these last few years, like, and how are you maintaining your health and wellness?
I think self-care is like a constant iterative process that I'm always trying to get better at. These interviews are heavy.
I can only imagine.
I mean, from suicide, domestic violence. I remember a gentleman that I interviewed who had checked himself out of the psych ward the night before because he lost his apartment.
Yo.
Because he was a former addict who had gotten his first apartment in his life. The building got condemned and he had 15 minutes to get all of his belongings. That was a huge trigger for him. We forget the people part of development in housing. And that's why I think this mixed method approach, this action approach, is so important. We need to humanize these questions of development in housing from the perspectives of those most impacted. How do I, address it? I have a therapist.
Real shit.
I think everyone needs a therapist. I think for Black and brown communities in particular, it's a very touchy topic. We have all these mythologies around self-care, help, and even therapy, which I understand the roots of where they come from. But I think we are the walking wounded. I believe that very deeply. I think we know how to keep moving, but never address what's really happening with us. And I'm not presuming to say that when I'm in therapy, I'm addressing everything, but I'm finding space to try to address something, a safe outlet to do those things. And also to reaffirm my purpose. And I think that really helps. And the stories, I take them everywhere I go. When I'm with policymakers, I'm hitting them with stories.
Yeah.
I'm you cannot, I don't want you leaving this room without humanizing the folks that you claim you're serving And I'm telling you, you're not.
Yeah, it felt really powerful and affirming to see you in that housing advisory committee meeting, because I'm there as an observer, or not as an observer, we're organizing, but when you're not in the committee, you got to sit on the side, and you hear so many people make such bold claims and speak so high and mighty in them rooms when nobody's there. But then when you got somebody there who can hold them stories and push back, it's like a whole different dynamic. I really appreciate it. We're getting close to our end time, so I just wanted to ask one more question. Like, we're coming up on national elections, and then right after that, we're going to have municipal elections. What would you like to hear on the housing front? What are you listening for in terms of like, what gets you excited? What are you hopeful for in these next couple of years that might, get kicked up and catch some momentum?
So the public housing came up briefly in our conversation.
Yeah.
In our report on evictions, we do talk a great deal about public housing. Man, there's a lot that needs to change on many scales. We understand that Ben Carson is deeply incompetent and should not be in the position that he is in.
Ben Carson is the director of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. For our listeners, I know I got some fresh ears out there. HUD and CURA stands for the Center
for Urban and Regional Affairs.
Bang, bang.
There needs to be a deep reinvestment and reevaluation of public housing nationally and locally. And one of the things that we pushed back a great deal in our report was there was not one person that we interviewed from public housing that said they lived there because they wanted to. They lived there because it's the most economical decision for them. They also talked about the levels of mismanagement taking place in these properties would be deeply appalling if you were in these spaces. Everything from extortion happening in these spaces, physical violence and things coming from actual workers, many of which have been documented, health issues as a result of living in these spaces. I really want to see some deep investment, both at the federal, state, and state level to make public housing respectable and habitable housing. I need someone to be unapologetic about that.
Hell yeah.
So, I mean, that's something I would love to see.
I'm driving around and realizing there's no reason that the city can't be financing like the most beautiful, flyest, sustainable buildings as public housing where people would really be excited about living. I'm with you on that. 100%. Hell yeah.
As far as development goes, there are a lot of programs that the city puts out and they say, we'll give this to you if like X% is affordable for a certain period of years, 15, 30, right? I have someone that I've worked with in city government that has confirmed for me that there have been multiple folks that have gotten these grants and have not done that. We have not litigated that. We have not made that public. Well, why? Because that would say something about our government and the folks that work within it. So I think there are these surface level commitments that we see and we just assume, oh, that's happening, right? And let's also be clear about the affordability percentages. That's a whole nother conversation. For instance, like in the area of Frogtown, we did this analysis. So at, median income, how many Frogtown residents could actually afford the affordable housing? Not one. So the reality of it is there's a ruse around what affordable luxury looks like when they're popping up all over the city, because the area median income is determined by both the Twin Cities area and some outlying suburban communities. So all those incomes are looped together where like $90K is supposed to be median income. Where if you go into places like North or Frogtown, median income is like 30, if not a little lower. So the metrics they're using to build this affordable luxury properties don't actually benefit the low income and Black and brown folks that live there. They know that. What are they doing about it? I want to hear someone talk about that.
Amen. Amen. Yes. Well, I wish we could keep going, but we're going to leave it there. I want to express my deep gratitude and thanks to Dr. Brittany Lewis for joining us on the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. Also, for our listeners who are getting tuned in, Isaac Spector working on the mic. Really appreciate your work. Check us out on Patreon. Check out the work of Dr. Brittany Lewis. We'll make sure we link into some of the maps and some of the studies that we're talking about. It's a heart-wrenching time in Minneapolis, but there's a lot of potential. And that's what I'm feeling right now, leaving this interview, is like, we got serious people who are ready to work and ready to go at it. So, you know, if you hear this and you get excited, check out Brittany's work, show up to a meeting, maybe for the first time, connect with a neighbor. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the company. Shauna told me I was gonna be prosperous. I listen. I'm just praying, making plays a positive addition. Trying to knock me off my spot would be preposterous. Y'all fishing in this bitch, illuminate like phosphorus. I glisten, gliding like a Christ on the water. Now you're christened, sliding like I'm ice over top the opposition. Hold a vision in my mind and make it pop about fruition. Expanding these demands, we will not crop the propositions. Shift the whole food, guarantee the whole mood. The rest, you're gonna inherit the earth that holds true. Culture, power,